Good afternoon. You're watching the English newscast on Future Television. I'm Tamim, and these are today's headlines. The United States Senate approves a bill that targets Hezbollah's finances. British Prime Minister David Cameron meets with French President François Hollande in Paris and says the UK should carry out military airstrikes alongside France in Syria. And Russian President Vladimir Putin is in Tehran for talks on the Syrian conflict. Former Prime Minister Saad Hariri has met with Progressive Socialist Party leader Walid Jumblat in Paris. The meeting reportedly tackled the overall situation in Lebanon and the consequences of the political deadlock on the country's stability, security and economy amid the regional turmoil. A statement from Hariri's media office said both men agreed to exert every effort to reach a national settlement that would end the presidential vacuum, revive state institutions and allow the cabinet and parliament to function again. The United States Senate has approved a bill that targets Hezbollah's finances, which includes institutions and people funding the party. The bill reportedly won the majority of votes of the Senate. It calls for the U.S. State Department to identify the media outlets that back and fund Hezbollah, such as Al-Manar Television. It also demanded the U.S. Treasury to impose harsh conditions against any foreign side that facilitates operations or launders money, or anyone who conspires to send funds to people or organizations linked to the party. In addition, the bill called for listing Hezbollah as a party that smuggles foreign drugs and that it be labeled as an international criminal organization. The bill also urged the U.S. President and Secretary of State to send reports to Congress on Hezbollah's financial activity and its drug smuggling operations. And in Lebanon, Justice Minister Ashraf Rifi has criticized the idea of electing a candidate with links to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad as Lebanon's next head of state. His remarks came as an apparent response to speculation that Marada movement leader Sleiman Frangish could become Lebanon's next president. The speculation arose after reports emerged that Frangish had recently met with former Prime Minister Saad Hariri over Lebanon's political crisis. Rifi added that regional and global developments indicate that a political solution to the nearly 5-year Syrian war will be achieved, but that it could take some time. British Prime Minister David Cameron sat down with French President François Hollande at the Élysée Palace in Paris for talks focusing on tackling the Islamic State. Hollande said his country will step up its fight against ISIS, launching a week of diplomacy with a meeting with Cameron. Speaking at a joint news conference, the British Prime Minister, for his part, said he was convinced the UK should carry out military airstrikes alongside France and other partners in Syria in an effort to defeat the group. Meanwhile, 19 raids and 16 arrests were carried out in Belgium, but there is still no sign of the prime Paris attack suspect, Salah Abdeslam. Russian President Vladimir Putin has arrived in Tehran on his first trip to Iran in 8 years for talks on the devastating conflict in Syria, where both countries support Damascus. He was set to hold talks with Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and President Hassan Rouhani on the one-day visit. And across the Atlantic, a Lebanese woman has become Argentina's new First Lady. Juliana Awada's husband, conservative opposition candidate Mauricio Macri, has won Argentina's presidential election, ending 12 years of leftist rule. Macri promised that a marvelous new era was starting for the country after he won the runoff vote on Sunday. Celine Dion paid an emotional tribute to the victims of the attacks in Paris during the live broadcast of the 2015 American Music Awards. The award-winning singer performed Edith Piaf's Hymne à l'amour in French, as images of French landmarks and French people uniting after the attacks were shown on the screen behind her. Dion drew tears from audience members and received a standing ovation for her performance. And coming up next, senior Middle East correspondent for The Guardian, Mr. Martin Chulov, is in our studios. Stay tuned for the exclusive. Welcome back. Over to you, Yumna.
Thank you, Linda. We have the pleasure today to welcome senior Middle Eastern correspondent for The Guardian, Mr. Martin Chulov. Thank you for being here, Martin.
It's a pleasure.
Now, we're here to discuss ISIS and the recent attacks on November 12th and 13th, which happened in Beirut and Paris, respectively, leading up to 46 deaths and 130 in Paris. Just before we start, I would like our audience to know that you've had discussions with senior members of ISIS. Is that correct?
It is indeed, yeah.
And I've heard you say that ISIS aspired to these kinds of attacks. We're going to get right into it. These attacks on bigger scales, because they've been training. About 15 to 20,000 people are training, and they're basing it on the old Al-Qaeda model. But they're much more tech savvy. They have social media, but on their side, they have a lot of, they're much more advanced than what Al-Qaeda was. Since you've talked to them, since you've said these things, do you also know if there's an actual way to get rid of them?
Well, the reality that ISIS have created over the last couple of years is something that no other modern terrorist organisation has been able to do, and that is command and control a large area of land, and they can still control to this day an area from the eastern edge of Aleppo in the eastern Syria right through to Mosul in western Iraq. The border between Iraq and Syria is now defunct. The area of land that they control is roughly the size of Jordan. There is no state military who is capable of taking them on the ground at this point. So what they've achieved in terms of areas that they control is very significant. Add to that around 15 to 20,000 foreign fighters who have travelled into their territory, primarily across the Turkish border, to set up their own caliphate, in their words, and their own rules of law. This is something which has actually been a feeding mechanism for people who might not otherwise be attached to the ideology, but are still impressed by what they see. So ISIS, as it is now, is a very formidable organisation. It is going to take a lot of defeating militarily, but beyond that, though, there is no defeating it just militarily. There does need to be a political alternative created to the message that ISIS puts forward, and that message is that to the Sunnis of the centre of the region, that we are here to protect your interest. We are here to re-enfranchise you, to re-empower you, to give you a dignity that has been stripped from you in the last 12 years of invasion and occupation.
Well, you mentioned, of course, the fact that there needs to be a strategic plan in order to be able to defeat ISIS. That also has to involve major regional powers. Russian President Vladimir Putin arrived to Iran this morning, and U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is in the UAE to meet with Emirati and his Saudi counterparts. Now, on a bigger scale, it's always been Russia allied to Iran and the U.S. with its Saudi ally. And since the beginning of the Syrian civil war, those are the sides they have taken. So how does this divide today, after these attacks, translate into a solution?
I think there's a broad and growing recognition that there is a common interest in ISIS being defeated one way or another. This organisation does pose a threat to all of the stakeholders in the region. You've mentioned most of them: Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran,
France now,
Turkey.
obviously.
France obviously has taken
Britain
a stake.
also.
The UK wants to. All of these players do need to get together at some point and thrash out whether there is a solution to the threat that ISIS poses, but beyond that, what this means for the post-Ottoman nation-state order that is more or less bound together the centre of the region for the last 100 years. All of these things are in play, and ISIS has made them in play, and it's going to take at least 5 to 10 years, I would have thought, before we have any clarity on where this goes from here.
Right, but a key issue that they've had, a major issue that they've had, is always this ambiguity when it comes to President Bashar al-Assad's future. And so the West will say, well, we do not want him, he cannot be part of the solution, although Philip Hammond, recently the British Foreign Secretary, said, no, we don't want him, but he may have to be part of the transition. So how does Assad's future come into play here?
It's a major negotiating chip. It's the card that the Russians and the Iranians have to play when they see it fit to play. They are not strategically wedded to him. he has become almost a liability in many ways in terms of
But he's still here.
Well, he is, and he's only there because he is the card that the Russians and the Iranians have to play. But they have had to put everything on the line, militarily, financially, to prop him up. There have been two occasions, late December 2012 and 3 months ago, where the rump of Syria that he controlled was at great risk of falling. Now, the Western position is that Assad and the brutality of his regime, the crackdown on the non-ideological opposition throughout this war has been a driving force for Sunni grievances, and that if the West were to pile in to fight ISIS while he was still there, then they would be perceived as taking sides with Assad. So for them it's very important that he moves on. For the Russians and the Iranians, it's not so important, but they will throw him overboard even when they have to.
Well, Russia has just been, so with the Russian plane coming down in Egypt, when we think that now Russia and the Americans, as well as the Iranians and the Saudis, aren't they all fighting the same enemy? Is Assad just the issue that's basically keeping everything from coming to an end? So, in other words, if Assad was to go away, would the Syrian war end today?
I do think that some significant steam would be taken out of the Syrian war if the Assad family...
So what do we do with ISIS, though?
Well, I think it would be much easier to form a united position to go against them then. The British, the Americans, Turkey and others would no longer have that impediment of being perceived as taking sides with Assad if they were fighting against ISIS. So I think that would intensify the war against ISIS by moving that, I guess, that contaminating factor in their thinking.
But so far, you know, I know U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and as well as President Obama, they've tried the diplomatic solution. They've tried to bring the Syrian opposition, the different groups together, and it's failed every single time, and they're trying again. And today, isn't it hard within the Syrian opposition, there are so many divisions, isn't it hard to know, well, who do we bring to the negotiating table and what parts of them are actually extremists that cannot be dealt with? How do we deal with that if Assad is to step aside?
It's hard and getting even more difficult. Throughout the evolution of the Syrian war, we've seen upwards of 1,000 different groups pop up, and they have had shifting allegiances. You have a non-ideological core, which is still strong, mainly around the Jordanian border, getting close to Daraa. In central Syria itself, around Hama and Homs, there's also a very strong, very competent remnants of the so-called Free Syrian Army. Idlib province in the north is Islamist stroke jihadists. It's Jabhat al-Nusra, it's Ahrar al-Sham. These are organisations that don't want a lot to do with a pluralistic, democratic Syria. So careful considerations need to be made about what do we do with Ahrar al-Sham, who do represent a core constituency in the far north. Do we include them in discussions about Syria's future? And of course then we move on to al-Nusra, who are a straight-up al-Qaeda proxy, and no one can envisage them being a party to any discussion.
It would be interesting to talk about the difference between the Nusra and ISIS, but I just want to bring it to Lebanon. You know, 2 million Syrian refugees, 4 million people, and obviously with the Syrian refugee crisis hampering the economy, can ISIS, which have kind of in sporadic different moments gotten through, but can they actually gain more influence here?
They're looking to do so, and they have been looking to do so for the last 2 years. The border, the Syrian-Lebanese border, has been porous for many years, as we know. However, the Lebanese military, and it must be said Hezbollah, have done a lot to tighten that border. It is now much more difficult to cross than it used to be. The border control there is quite efficient, but it's not perfect, as we saw in Burj al-Barajni in those deadly events 2 weeks ago. The real issue in Lebanon is, could there be a homegrown revolt? Is there enough of a constituency in this country who would adhere to the ISIS ideology? And I think the answer so far is no. There's not a critical mass of those people. There are individuals, there are small cells, but could they pose an existential threat to the state as it is now? I think the answer is in the negative.
All right, I just have one last question. You know, the France's Prime Minister Manuel Valls said that there is a chemical attack that ISIS could be planning. Are we overestimating ISIS, or is this something to worry about?
They've certainly got chemical weapons. They've used them twice against a small community in Merah in northern Syria, just on the Turkish border.
Can they export them?
This is something that they're aspiring to do. It's a difficult thing to do, but they've surprised us in the last 2 weeks with their reach and capacity. I think we have to reconsider whether they are able to export this particularly potent threat, which would clearly be a tipping point in terms of the global response to them.
Right. Hopefully it wouldn't get to that point. Do you believe it will?
I think intelligence efforts are being redoubled now. We saw a dramatic failing of French and Belgian intelligence in Central Europe. I think there is abundant incentive to ensure that that doesn't happen again and to make sure that any potential supply lines are shut down.
All right. Thank you so much for being with us. That was Senior Middle East Correspondent for The Guardian, Mr. Martin Shulaf. Back to you, Linda.
Thank you, Yumna. This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our headlines. The United States Senate approves a bill that targets Hezbollah's finances. British Prime Minister David Cameron meets with French President François Hollande in Paris and says the UK should carry out military airstrikes alongside France in Syria. And Russian President Vladimir Putin is in Tehran for talks on the Syrian conflict. Those are your headlines for today. Thank you all for tuning in.